Hi, my name is Susan Reid, and we're here at King Arthur Flour in the Baking Education Center. And today I'm going to show you how to make King Arthur's favorite white sandwich bread. Now, making your own bread is not only cost-saving, but it's delicious. And this recipe has been in the King Arthur Flour family for over 5 generations. It's originally known as Walter Sands bread. He's the father of our current chairman of the board. So the first thing we're going to do is start with some water. We're going to measure out 1 cup plus 2 tablespoons, which is 9 ounces of water. How much water a bread recipe needs can depend on how wet or dry the weather is. If it's really humid out, you want to use the lower end of water that's given in the recipe range. If it is dry, like in the middle of the winter, your doughs will need a little bit more water because the flour is like a sponge. It will either take water from the air or release water to the air. So I have 9 ounces of water right here. And next comes the yeast. I happen to be using instant yeast here, which can get mixed in without taking an extra step to proof it. If this was active dry yeast, you would do exactly what I'm doing now and put the yeast in the water and give it a few minutes to dissolve and see if some bubbles happen. So you can use either one in the recipe. It will work either way. Next, I'm going to add a little bit of sweetener, both for the dough and the yeast. I'm going to use some honey, but you can use whatever you like. I'm going to put about 2 tablespoons of honey into this. This loaf of bread calls for 3½ cups of flour. And to make sure that you are not putting too much flour in the recipe, at King Arthur we recommend that you measure it this way. You want to stir the flour up in your bucket, sprinkle it into a dry measuring cup with a flat surface, and level off the top. Now that cup of flour should weigh 4¼ ounces. In the test kitchen at King Arthur we always use scales because it's just a lot quicker. So I'm going to keep adding flour to this bowl until it reads 17 ounces. Now I'm going to add the salt, which not only gives the bread some flavor, but it also helps to control the action of the yeast. And dry milk powder goes next. And we're going to add 2 tablespoons of butter. The butter helps the texture of the bread dough, and it also adds a nice flavor. It helps to inhibit staling. Those are all things that happen in your dough. I'm going to bring the dough together using our magic dough whisk, which is particularly good for getting yeast doughs started. Now, I'm pretty confident of this recipe because I've made it a lot recently, but if you've never made bread dough before, I strongly recommend that you keep ½ cup of the flour of the recipe out on your bench because you don't know if the dough is going to need all of it. See, this looks a little bit dry, so I have 2 options here. If I had left this flour out on my bench, it probably wouldn't be dry. I can give it another tablespoon of water at this point, which I think I'm going to do. There we go. And that should help bring the dough together more easily. Now I'm going to use a handy tool called a bowl scraper to help the dough come together. Kneading the dough helps the yeast get distributed evenly throughout the dough. And it helps to develop the gluten, which is the protein in the flour, which gives your bread its structure. So right now, this is kind of what we would call a shaggy mass. And what I'm going to do is just take the dough, fold it over on itself, and give it a 1/4 turn. Now, the objective here is not to add too much flour, so I don't want to put a lot of flour on the dough. I want to put the flour on my hands. And as you can see right now, this dough is kind of lumpy and not very smooth. As I work with this, the personality of the dough is going to change quite a bit. So I'm just going to fold it over towards myself, gently push it away, and then give the dough a 1/4 turn. Now, when you do this, we often have people, when we're teaching them to knead, who use bread dough for therapy. And they have some issues, and very frequently they will push very hard on the dough. And when you do that, it will open up the dough so that all the wet parts on the inside are exposed, and then the dough gets sticky, and then in order to be able to work with it, you keep adding more flour. So if you happen to be someone, and you know who you are, that we would describe as an aggressive kneader, be nice to your dough. It's alive, and if you're nice to it, it in turn will reward you with a higher quality product. Okay, we've been kneading this dough long enough now that it's nice and smooth. It's a little bit bouncy. And how do you know when the dough is done? Usually if you give it a little poke and it bounces back at you, that tells you that the gluten is developed enough that it's ready for its first rise. So what we're going to do is just take the same bowl that we mixed this in, and we'll scrape out any crusty bits. Didn't quite make the cut of the final dough. And we're going to grease the bowl, and the dough is going to go into the bowl, and just turn it over. And now we're going to cover it with a handy dandy little shower cap. And this dough needs to rise for about an hour to an hour and a half. It's going to double and get kind of big and puffy looking. We've given our bread a chance to rise, and now we're going to shape it into a loaf. Scoop it out of the bowl. You can see all those nice bubbles from the yeast doing its job. So I'm going to take a little bit of flour, just flour my hands, keep things from sticking. I'm going to pat this out into a little bit of a rectangle and just fold it from the ends to the middle, and then fold it once again from the ends to the middle. Now it's roughly square, and I'm going to bake this. This is a slightly larger loaf of bread. Most people, if they only have one loaf pan in their house, it's usually a 9 by 5 inch loaf pan. So that's what this loaf is designed for. I'm going to spray it a little bit with some nonstick spray. And then I'm going to use what I call the belt-and-suspenders approach. I'm going to line this pan with some parchment paper, because once the bread is cooked and you take it out of the oven, you want to make sure that the bread doesn't sit in this pan and get steamed, because that'll make it tough. So if I have this parchment paper here, once the bread is done, I have a couple of handles that will help me just pop it right out of the pan. So we're going to let this rise a second time, and we're going to let the dough come up about a little bit over the edge of the pan. You don't want to let it rise too high, because then the yeast won't have any energy left to finish up. You want to get a last little jump once you put the bread in the oven. So we'll cover this, and we're going to let it rise for 45 minutes up to an hour, and then we'll bake it. So our white bread is done, and you can see this little hole here. That's how I was testing to make sure that it was finished. If you want to know how your bread is, if your bread is done, if you have an instant read thermometer, what you can do is just take the temperature of the middle of the bread, and if it reads 190 degrees, then the bread is done. And that's what happened with our bread. It was finished, and now you have what you need for the perfect peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Beautiful loaf of bread, and I guarantee you will never go back to store-bought.